Hey, everybody. Welcome to our July 4th edition of Shank's Children's Lit Zoom extravaganza. Happy holidays to you. Uh, I'm going to keep this one a little bit shorter than the other ones have been, but there are a couple of things I do want to cover today. I want to talk about, at least a little bit, share your capsule critiques that you turned in last week, and they are now posted on Canvas for you to read in some detail. And again, it's more of an FYI kind of thing. I'm not going to quiz you or test you on each other's capsule critiques, but I just thought they were very well done. And if you do read through them, and I'm going to share them in a second, I think you're going to find some really good analysis. And these are the kinds of things that I wanted to give you some practice in doing so that you could become familiar with the things that we do to analyze picture books. And like I said, you did a really nice job on this. I think the particularly most challenging part of the analysis is to analyze the illustrations. And you can talk about the plot and the storyline and comment on that. But since they are picture books, obviously you have to be able to analyze the effectiveness of the illustrations, what styles were used and how elements of art like color and shape were used. Also, how the illustrations enhanced the story, where they were placed on the page in relation to the text, all those kinds of things I wanted you to have some practice in doing. And like I said, most of you did a really, really nice job on that. So I want to share that with you. Then I also want to touch a little bit on, this is not a separate genre that we're doing in the class, but I thought since we were doing the Hunger Games, we might talk a little bit about dystopian fiction, because I think this is obviously a really good example of that. And I think older children of the age of, 10, 11, 12, if you were going to teach the Hunger Games or share this with them, this is something you could introduce, and I think they would understand it and appreciate it and be mature enough to handle it. Because when you stop and think about it, I didn't ask this as a quiz question. I probably could have, but certainly there are a lot of examples of works for kids and young adults that are in the dystopian category. And so it would be kind of a good idea to familiarize them with, the concept and the characteristics of it. So that's what I had you read a little bit about for today. And I want to go over that a little bit. And also, before I say anything more, let me give you the first number. Number 17. 17 will be our first number. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about dystopian fiction, and then we will get into and continue our discussion of the Hunger Games. I ask you to read to the end for today. So we're going to go over the part 3 questions today as kind of a way to wrap up the things that happen in the story. And then I want to touch a little bit on the homework quiz that was due for today, the analysis questions on the Hunger Games. And I want to do a few of those today. We'll talk about how archetypes are present. We'll talk about how particular themes are shown in the story. And we'll also talk about how it is an example of dystopian fiction. And then I'm going to save the other answers that you did, the more personal answers, like what are some of your examples of other works that use classical archetypes? Another question was what you thought the age appropriateness should be. We'll save that discussion for later. Another question was, can you think of other role models that would be good for kids? And is Katniss a good role model? So some of those questions are of a more personal opinion type response. And I think a nice way to wrap up the Hunger Games for next time is to share your answers to some of those questions. So that's what's on tap for today. Let me start, though, by previewing and explaining the next homework. assignment, so let's get to that. We are going to start moving into fairy tales as our next sub-genre under the myth, fairy tales, and folk tales umbrella. So obviously, The Hunger Games deals with myth or is a representation of myth. Next, I want to have you read some examples of fairy tales and analyze those. So that's going to be the basis for the homework and the reading for next time. So first of all the assignments, as usual, are due before Sunday, July 7th. Also due, if you are one of the two students who are presenting picture books, your picture book presentations are due. And I might as well look ahead to the next class session after that. If you are in the myth, fairy tale, or folk tale group of presenters, your presentations will be due the following Wednesday by midnight. So picture book presentations due Sunday by midnight, and fairy tale, folk tale, myth presentations due by Wednesday of next week by midnight. So just looking ahead a little bit. All right, obviously, watch this lecture and record the numbers in sequence. And let me give you another one, 28. 28 is our second number. All right, and then as I said, we are going to get into fairy tales next week. So there are some Canvas readings that I'd like you to take a look at that help prepare you for discussion of fairy tales and folk tales. So 68 to 79, 88 to 89, and 98 to 106. And then very importantly as well, in the Canvas files, the list of Canvas files, having trouble talking today. Please read the fairy tale notes because it will give you, I listed all the common motifs and conventions that we find in fairy tales. These are the things that make them fairy tales. So I want you to be familiar with those before you read the examples of fairy tales that I will assign to you here. So after you've read the Canvas material, then you can start reading the fairy tales in the book that I wanted you to get for fairy tales. It's the Golden Book of Fairy Tales. And I included a picture of it. I realized when I came home last night, I didn't bring the copy of the book so I could share it with you here. So I went ahead and took a picture on it from Google, and this is the book you should be using. Hopefully you have that. It's a big book. It's not real thick, but it's a beautiful big book, beautifully illustrated. And I chose it among so many other fairy tale collections because I think it does a really good job of not only giving you a nice cross section of fairy tales from different parts of the world, but also, like I said, it's very well illustrated. And the text is very good. It's easy to understand. And I think I think it's a good introduction to fairy tales, at least reading fairy tales. I'm sure probably when kids are little, including you and me, we might have had fairy tales read to us, or maybe some representation of fairy tales in a Disney movie. But at some point they can read their own fairy tales. And I think this would be a good book to introduce them to the full story and really the classic story behind these fairy tales. A lot of times, especially Disney over the years has been accused of taking the classic fairy tales and changing them, Disneyfying them, if that's such a word. And so these are the originals and pretty much the original context. All right, so in the fairy tales book, I'm not going to ask you to read each and every one of them, but I am going to ask you to read the ones as I have noted here. Instead of jotting down all the titles, which I was too lazy to do, I ask you to read the stories that begin on the following pages. So you'll see those. So 7, 12, 27, etc. So those are the ones you are responsible for in the Golden Book collection of fairy tales. And then after you have read those, then there is a homework quiz writing assignment due before class next Monday. So by noon, I'm sorry, by midnight on Sunday. Um, it's the Golden Book Fairy Tales Comparative Analysis Assignment. So there are a series of questions there that I'm going to ask you to write out answers to after you've read the fairy tales and after you've read the material on fairy tales. And I think that'll be a really good introduction for us to fairy tales, and it's something we'll spend some time discussing next week. Um, and then we'll talk also next week a little bit about folk tales as well. So fairy tales and folk tales will be the main agenda next week as we wrap up the Hunger Games. And then also toward the end of next week, next Thursday's video, I will prepare you for the midterm, which will happen the week after that. So that's what's up on tap. That's what's coming up. We're moving right along here with the semester, and thank you for keeping up. And I hope you're enjoying the class so far, and I am. And well, enough of that. Enough of us patting ourselves on the back for doing our jobs. Okay, anyway, so that's the assignment. If you have any questions about it, uh, let me know, email me, and I can clarify that for you. All right, so let's get back to a close-up of me and all my glory. Charlie is not around today. Hopefully he'll show up a little bit later on. He was very happy, by the way, that you got question 30 right in the Hunger Games quiz. Everybody got his name right. You know, if you'd gotten it wrong, I would have had to fail you, and that would have been very sad. So, all right, the next thing I wanted to do is just share with you briefly your capsule critique answers, which I thought, again, were very well done. You know, I know you by name now. I don't know you by face. I've never met any of you, but I'm starting to get to know you by the work that you do. And I've been very, very impressed. And again, I encourage you to read all of these in some detail. Uh, they were very well done and a nice variety. I think Shel Silverstein was mentioned a couple times. Um, what was a bad case of stripes was actually mentioned twice. What are the odds? I mean, we only have like 9 people in class, and yet we had one book that was mentioned by 2 people, which is okay. That's fine. Um, and again, excellent analysis, good plot summaries. Um, and again, I was particularly looking at how effectively you discussed and described the effectiveness of the illustrations, the art, because after all, these are picture books. And I ask you to pay particular attention to the answers to this, and maybe some of these capsule critiques might inspire you to check out some of these books. Maybe some of them you're already familiar with. A few of them are classics. Uh, well, Silverstein, a couple of his works were mentioned. A Giraffe and a Half, that's one of his lesser known works, but it's a wonderful little book. How many of you grew up with the Berenstain Bears? I have a feeling there might be a few people who have done that. Of course, those are a whole series of books, each one dealing with, you know, some kind of issue or situation or problem that real kids go through. And we see how the Berenstain Bears handle it, and it helps us understand the situation and maybe helps us handle it too. In this case, Gabby picked the one about too much junk food. Tyara, I'm glad somebody did this one. I mentioned this one the other day. Heather Has Two Mommies, one of the most influential and controversial picture books ever, really, and still is to this day. But hopefully we've made some progress in the 40 years. I think it's some 40 years now since that book was published, almost. And she also did the bad case of stripes, so she did that. Emma did On the Night You Were Born. Interesting, all of these books got pretty high grades too. Occasionally a student will pick one that they just hated and give it an F. But I guess when we're left to our own choice, we'd prefer to share with our audience the books we liked. So most of these got A's or A minuses or B pluses. Haley did Lola Goes to School. And again, excellent descriptions of the art. In this case, she uh, found it representational, surrealistic, and impressionistic. Of all those, she found it to be impressionistic. Um, and again, ask yourself, why did the author, whether they were the illustrators themselves or maybe they had somebody else illustrate, why did the author choose this form of style of art to best tell their stories? And you'll see that, if it's effectively chosen, it can enhance the work, it can enhance the story and make it even more entertaining and effective. Um, Sorry to go back and forth like this. The Bad Seed was reviewed. Shreya did The Giving Tree, very well known by Shell. And it is kind of a folk tale or a parable, and we will again get more into folk tales next week. And I liked her discussion here at the end. She would give the book an A. What we see in recent years is sometimes we revisit classic texts with a more modern viewpoint, and sometimes they are considered dated or maybe some issues uh, that we didn't consider at the time, but now we do. Um, this book has incited a lot of controversy in recent years. It promotes selfishness, it promotes sexist ideas, etc. But she says, I don't think Silverstein intends the story as a didactic morality play. Um, it teaches a good job of empathy, and that's what it was all about. Um, and also, again, she also did The Bad Case of Stripes by Shannon. That's a wonderful picture. Oh, well, all of these are really good. Some of them, like I said, I was not familiar with, so I'm going to check out on my own, but that's one I know very well. Kaylin did The Home Builders. And again, it's interesting, you would think in most cases a picture book for kids would not be controversial or have issues, but and I noticed in most of your answers you say, well, I don't really see any issue or problem with this particular picture book, which is usually the case, but it is interesting, you know, sometimes a work by Shel Silverstein, like we saw, or Heather Has Two Mommies, or whatever the issue might be, might, engender some kind of uh, controversy or objection, or be on banned or challenged book lists. Also did Outside Over There. Sounds like an interesting book, a goblin fantasy. Jenna White did A Magical Day with Matisse, which I think we mentioned earlier in another assignment. So I'm glad she followed that up with actually explaining it in the capsule critique. Matisse obviously was a very famous painter. And then Olivia, I have a feeling many of you are probably familiar with Olivia, a very popular book. Great analysis. This was the kind of thing I was talking about in 7 and 8. She does a wonderful job of analyzing the effectiveness of the illustrations. Very well done. And again, I think of all of these things, that was probably the most difficult to do. It's kind of like when you ask about music and you say, why did you like that song? We tend to focus just on the lyrics and the story it tells. But if you're really pressed and you have to start talking about, well, the use of the guitar here or the orchestration or whatever, it gets a little bit more difficult to kind of put into words what makes the song so wonderful. We tend to just focus on the story. But I wanted to challenge you and ask you to look at the illustrations too. And like I said, in this case, She did a wonderful job. Grace Buffalo Fluffalo, which was one I was not familiar with, but now I'm going to check it out. If for no other reason, the title alone interests me. And also the Mischievans is another one that interests me just based on the title, and her explanation, her description is really good too. Sounds like a more modern day story. She says it's a mix of naive, retro, and stylized art. So I'm going to check that one out. Lauren did I Am Enough. And again, excellent analysis in number 5 and number 7 as well. And she also did John's Turn, talking about the different plot elements. Now, again, here is a book that, might be on a banned or challenged book list for the reasons that she talks about, and she supports the book. So I think she does an excellent job of discussing the issues and what the potential objections might be, still while defending the work as something a child could read or should read. So she gave it, I guess that's an A, or is it an A minus? I can't tell. I wish the book was slightly longer, but overall, this is a great book about empathy, acceptance, and challenging gender stereotypes. However, it is not queer representation, and that's okay. So very important, interesting distinction that she makes there. And very well done. And then Urali, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, did On a Magical Do Nothing Day, which is what my day is going to be like after I'm done with this. So he summarizes the plot for us. And then the storm whale sounded very interesting to me as well. A boy named Noy finds a little whale on the beach. He takes it home and they become friends, having fun with their family. And he gives it a B+. All right, so there they are, all the capsule critiques that you guys did. And again, I encourage you to read them in more detail than I did. I was just kind of scanning through them. And all these books I'm sure are available in your local library, or if you really want to get interested in them, and you might want to buy them on Amazon. That's what I'm going to do. So I thank you for that. You did a wonderful job with that. All right, let's give you another number. Let's do 31. All right, I had you read a little bit about this, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with the concept already, but it might be a new one for kids. And again, if you were teaching something like the Hunger Games in a classroom, or you were just, making this available to kids in your lives, it might be an interesting concept to also bring up to them and introduce to them. So it might help them better enjoy the story, and then also see its relationship to other stories, because dystopian fiction is a booming genre in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And maybe because our situation seems to get more and more dire as the days and years go on. So the concepts that are brought up in dystopian fiction maybe don't seem that far in the future. I'll leave that up to you to agree or disagree with me on that. But it's something that I think kids would find interesting, and I think certain kids and certainly young adults gravitate to this kind of story. So let me just go through basically the file that I had you look over for today. And again, I compiled these from different sources, so you wouldn't have to buy a big $150 textbook. And pretty good general definition of dystopian literature is right there. good list of characteristics of dystopian settings. There are different subsets of dystopian literature, as you can see there. Interesting to note, why write a dystopian work? What's the function? What's the goal? What's the reason for doing so? This setting genre examines the weaknesses in our social and political systems and the complexity of human nature. Magnifying these subjects within a dystopian setting allows the author to illustrate what might happen if power runs unchecked, and/or if existing structures of governance and social order stop working for the greater good. Dystopias expose the inherent flaws in systems, societies, and people. All right, there it is. And one of the reasons, again, they remain so popular and so common is because, many of us look ahead to the future and we're kind of scared. And they serve as warnings and have served as warnings ever since the concept and the genre began. I'm sure many of you are familiar with works like 1984, and all of those. That's the granddaddy, I guess, of them all. Fahrenheit 451, another one. But again, we see them booming, and kids are drawn to these, and there are so many great examples, including the Hunger Games. And what I wanted to focus on, I think this is a really good list. And hopefully you kind of went by this when you were answering the question about whether we see or how we see dystopian characteristics in the Hunger Games. So here they are. Oftentimes these settings portray themselves as utopias. Oh, look at how wonderful our system is. It's so much better than what we had before. But you don't have to scratch very much below the surface to see that they're not utopians. They're a terrible system, which subjugates and penalizes and hurts their citizens. So a lot of times there's that nice veneer, and underneath it all is something really bad. Just reminded me of a movie I saw not too long ago, Don't Worry, Darling. Don't Worry, Darling, if you've ever seen that, with Florence Pugh. Kind of the same thing. Now that's a movie for adults, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. It's a great example of a world that appears to be a utopian. Oh boy, wouldn't you love to live in this system, in this world? But there's evil underneath it all. Other options, other ways that we see dystopian fiction, social stratification, social classes are clearly delineated, and you can't move from one to the other. The nation state is ruled by an upper class, a very small minority with very few democratic ideals. Propaganda runs rampant. Those in control everything, including what information goes out and what news, if any, goes out. They control, all forms of communication. And the message that is sent out is the message they want to be sent out. So propaganda becomes very, very important. Strict conformity among citizens and the general assumption that dissent and individuality are bad. So we see that in a lot of works. Or like in Divergent, you are assigned early on to what group you're going to be in, and that's the group you're going to be in. And if you are divergent, that's seen as a threat. So that's a good example of that. A state figurehead that people worship fanatically through a vast personality cult. The one figure that everybody is supposed to look up to, the king, the leader. Big Brother is perhaps obviously the best example of that in 1984. Another thing we see common in a lot of these stories is a fear or disgust of the world outside the state. So our country or our world is all that matters. We don't even concern ourselves with what's going on in the rest of the world. A common view of traditional life, particularly organized religion, as primitive and nonsensical. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in regards to the Hunger Games in a minute, but I'll save that one for now. And the next one is complete domination by a state religion. And what's interesting about these two, placed right next to each other, is they almost seem contradictory. But I would say that in regards to religion, here's how most dystopian works deal with religion. They do it in one of two ways. They either create a world where there is only one religion and everybody has to adhere to it upon horrible penalties, including death, or there's no mention of religion at all. So apparently, in the not too distant future, who's ever running the dystopian world has eliminated the threat of any kind of belief system for its citizens. So religion is handled either, well, there's one religion that everybody has to accept, or there's no religion at all. And well, I guess I will talk about it now. We'll talk more about how these apply to the Hunger Games in a minute. But I think it's interesting that if you notice, at least in book one, part one, no mention of religion at all. No mention of churches in District 12, no mention of praying. So apparently, over the years, the Capitol in Panem, that's one of the first things they must have done away with. The right to worship whatever religion you wanted to worship was taken away. So again, that makes it different than a lot of other dystopians where, well, I can think of, like The Handmaid's Tale, where there's like that one religion that everybody has to adhere to. So kind of interesting. It goes one of two ways usually in dystopian works. The memory of institutions overriding or taking precedence over human memory. And again, this is kind of tied in with propaganda. If I'm creating and I'm controlling the news and the information that goes out, it's in my best interest maybe to rewrite history as well so that it suits my purpose or it suits our propaganda. So, you keep waiting for the people who remember how it really was to die out, and you can instead indoctrinate the younger ones who don't remember how it was before we took control and brainwash them into believing that this is the best system ever and it's the only system that's ever existed. So, I think you see elements of this throughout history. It's an old cliche, but it's true. The winners of the battles and the winners of the wars get to rewrite history, and they often rewrite it to suit their own aims and interests, and it may not always be the truth. So that's what people in power do. They not only control the information about what's going on now, but they will, change history. They'll rewrite history, or they will have you forget about certain aspects of history that they don't want you to remember. So we see that certainly in dystopian worlds. And I'll ask you if maybe we also see it in aspects of our own lives. Other things, the middle class is pretty much done away with. Constant surveillance by the government is a key foundation of most dystopian works. We got to know what the people are doing at all times. We have to have surveillance, or we have to have spies. And so you never know who to trust or who to talk to because they could be spies and they could report you to somebody. A penal system that lacks due process. That's a scary thing. But in most dystopian scenarios, that is the fact. Militarized police forces and private security forces. So the people who are carrying out the orders and carrying out the laws are almost like militarized forces. which overwhelm and overpower anybody who might try to fight back. And if you don't have due process of law, in addition to that, then you really have no rights as a citizen or as a person. Construction of fictional views of reality that the populace are coerced into believing. And again, this kind of ties in with the propaganda. In Hitler's day and afterwards, it was called the big lie. You keep telling one lie over and over and over again. Eventually people will believe it. So again, it kind of goes in with propaganda. It goes in with rewriting history, right? Oh no, it really didn't happen that way. You may remember it that way, but here's our version of it, and you better start believing with our version of it. A lot of corruption in the system, fictional rivalries between groups that actually operate as a cartel. I don't know that that's so true in the Hunger Games, but as we brought up the other day when I was going over the quiz questions, I ask you, why do they do the Hunger Games every year? Why do they do this horrible thing where 2 children from each district are sent to their deaths and only one can survive? Why in the world would they do that? And, there are some official reasons why they do it. They have to justify their actions. But I mentioned the other one, which is this keeps the districts against one another, pitted against one another. Make them hate one another more than they hate us, the capital. So I think that's another reason, maybe even the more important reason for having the games. And an overall slow decay of the systems. When you start to see that the government that you depended on will no longer help you, that the institutions that you have believed in will benefit you no longer do or no longer exist. When you look around and all of these things are collapsing around you, then there's very little hope for you unless you give in and go along with this system that this dystopian world has created, wherever it might be and whatever work it might be in. So I'm hoping that as you were going through these different qualities and characteristics, you said to yourself, I don't know if you're a big dystopian fan, or maybe you didn't realize you were until you read over these characteristics and said to yourself, wow, a lot of the stories that I enjoy, a lot of TV shows have these as a premise, a lot of movies, obviously, and of course the classic books that we've talked about all have dystopian aspects to them to the point where we would call them dystopian. And usually they're set in a not too distant future, in a place much like ours. And it's kind of like the author saying, you know what, if we're not careful, if we don't change things, if we're not more vigilant, then this world that I have created that we read about and we say, oh my God, we would never live in a society where they take 2 kids from each district or each state or whatever and have them kill one another. We would never stoop that low. Well, I think Suzanne Collins, and this is just one example, is an author who would say, don't be so sure, When we wrap up the Hunger Games in our next lecture, I'll touch on this a little bit more. I have a hypothetical situation that I like to bring up and talk about that I think really makes this point stronger, but I think I'll save that for our next video. But that's dystopian fiction. So if I were to ask you about this on the midterm, and if I were to ask you what are some aspects of dystopian fiction that you see in the Hunger Games, you'd be able to answer that question. All right, let me give you another number. Let's give you 42. 42. All right, speaking of the Hunger Games, let's talk a little bit more about Katniss and her situation. And I want to go over the questions that you did for today. We'll cover the comprehension questions in this first part, and I made that 10 points. And then the analysis questions, I made a total of 30 points. So I think we'll call this all one big quiz worth 40 points. So that's how you'll see it in your Canvas grade list. All right, so this is the beginning of part 3. At the end of part 2, a very critical and important moment in the story when the Capitol announces that 2 winners from the same district can be chosen. It's the first time that they've ever allowed more than one victor in the Hunger Games, but we're going to change our rules, and we can have 2 winners as long as they're from the same district. And we talked a little bit about the ramifications of that and why the Capitol would do that, because they don't do anything just for the hell of it. I think one reason might be, again, because it's very popular. You know, the star-crossed lovers archetype is playing well with the people watching at home, and they're pulling for Peeta and Katniss. And, you know, it's clear, I think, especially if you watch the movie, it's clear that Peeta, you know, has had a thing for Katniss for a long time. Some might call him a stalker, but anyway. But, you know, Katniss, for various reasons, initially fights off any kind of connection with Peeta. You know, it's like, yeah, you know, he's done some nice things for me and I like him, and maybe I'm starting to have feelings for him. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there can only be one winner. So, you know, I can't get too close because I may have to kill him. In fact, I think there's one line, I know there is. What do I say? I think I know there is. She says in her narration, a kind Peeta Malark is far more dangerous to me than an unkind one. And of course, basically what she's saying there is, you know, I can't afford to have feelings for this person. I'd rather he be unkind. I'd rather he be somebody I don't like. I'd rather him be an adversary than somebody I can get close to and care about. Even though I'm playing that role because, you know, I'm clever enough to know that it's probably working at home. And again, they get sent gifts and so on, so it is working. But, you know, until the Capitol makes the announcement, you know, we can have 2 winners, I think, you know, she is very, very hesitant to really commit to him in any kind of personal way. But then that sets up all of part 3, in which, you know, it now is the 2 of them trying to survive and end up being, you know, the last 2 standing, so to speak. And of course they are, but not before a lot of interesting and exciting things happen. All right, so a couple of quick comprehension questions. How did Peeta learn his camouflaging technique? And of course, the answer is he's the son of a baker, so he's used to decorating cakes. One little joke I always make in class, if you've seen the movie, when she comes upon him, you know, he's on a riverbank or whatever, covered in mud and whatever. And it's, you know, it's Academy Award winning makeup. You know, this kid is really good at what he does, and it's all the more interesting that he's able to do this when he's near death. But anyway, it's a little bit over the top in the movie. Every time I see it in the movie, I kind of chuckle. I say, "Wow, he's pretty damn good." But anyway, that's how he learns his camouflaging technique. The other joke I always throw in is, "What's his real specialty as a baker?" I wait a few minutes and then I say, his real specialty is, wait for it, pita bread. And of course, the class of 30 just, you know, falls off their chairs laughing. So I'm assuming that you just laughed your ass off. So I'm just going to picture that in my mind. Yeah, pita bread. Did nobody else think of that? Of course, it's not the right spelling, but anyway. A little bit of, I got to throw in a little humor because we're talking about the Hunger Games and kids are getting killed. So I got to be funny. Okay. All right. When she does come upon him, this kid has no shortage of health issues. He's really, like I said, he is near death. And you could have mentioned things like, well, he has the huge wound in his leg, which is the main thing. So he has a huge gash in his leg. He has a wound there. He's suffering from fever. He's got tracker jacker stings. He's horny. He's All right, that's another joke I usually like to throw in. And again, the kids in the class just fall off their chairs laughing right before they leave the class. But anyway, so he has all kinds of issues. So, a good part, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but a good part of part 3 is kind of downtime where the two of them connect. And if you remember, one of the archetypes in classical myth is the innermost cave that sometimes the heroes and heroines repair to. And they literally spend a lot of time in an innermost cave, kind of hiding out while Peter recuperates. All right, what gift is sent as a result of their first kiss? Well, there's that healing broth um, that starts to break his fever and make him feel a little bit better. And again, like I said, they have a chance to reminisce and talk about life in District 12. What was the happiest day she can remember? She reveals that it's the day she was able to get her little sister her pet goat. So when Prim got her goat. But it's interesting, she does have to change the story a little bit. The real story behind it is she kind of got it on the black market, so she couldn't admit that on TV. But, there's not a whole lot of fun events in District 12. It's a real grind. It's a real struggle just to survive. But, there were some moments of happiness, and that was the first thing that she thought of for that answer. I thought it was kind of revealing, that answer. All right, then things start to speed up a little bit. We're down to just a handful of tributes now. Question 5, who saves Katniss from sure death and why? And of course, it was Thresh who saves her from Clove. Clove was about ready to kill her. Clove is the girl from District 2, along with Cato. And Thresh, out of some loyalty to Rue and for what Katniss had done for Rue, kills Clove, because Clove, I mean, she was Katniss was a goner, but Thresh kills Clove and then runs off without killing Katniss, which would have been probably would have been the smart thing to do for him. But again, it shows, empathy between the districts, which is probably the last thing the Capitol wants. And this was one more example of it. And unfortunately, of course, for Thresh, he dies. Well, he kind of dies off camera, so to speak. Eventually, the mutations get him. So, but he showed this kindness toward Rue. I'm sorry, toward Katniss in that very key scene. Obviously, that's a major moment in the story. All right, couple other things. Again, they have a chance to reminisce, and Peeta reveals that he's kind of had a thing for Katniss ever since the first day of school, when she sang. So again, stalker, little joke. It's just a joke. Okay. Then they also talk about previous Hunger Games, and this answered at least a little bit the question that I had about my favorite character. Haymitch is a very interesting character in that, he comes across in the beginning as sort of this, drunken loser, almost comic relief kind of thing. But as the games progress and it becomes apparent that Katniss might actually have a chance to win this thing, we see it a little bit in the book because she can't tell us a lot about what Haymitch is going through in the book. We see it probably more in the movie, but he kind of snaps out of it and becomes a true mentor and help to them. And we look at this guy in the beginning, at least, and we say, well, how in the hell could this guy have ever won anything, let alone the Hunger Games? And we find out that he won by outsmarting everybody else. And I won't give away how he does that. If you want to read the future books, more is told about that. But I think it's enough to know that, it doesn't always just take great brute strength and force to win these things, you have to have a certain amount of cunning and intelligence. And apparently Haymitch, did that, was able to do that. And by the way, as far as Haymitch goes, the reason I think he's such an interesting character is that, in the beginning, he is this drunk who, falls all over himself. And when they ask him, do you have any advice for us? Remember that line? He says, yeah, I got 2 words for you: stay alive. Is that good enough for you? But if you kind of look into his character a little bit more, uh, I think there's a empathy for that character. And what I mean by that is you have to imagine that this is a guy who, after he won his Hunger Games, every year after that, I wonder if you thought about this. Every year after that, he had to mentor 2 kids, maybe as young as 12, and from District 12. So they're not going to win. They're going to be slaughtered. Nobody from District 12 hardly ever wins. He was one of the rare exceptions. And so you can imagine, after year after year after year of this, of trying, I imagine that in the beginning, he maybe did really try to help these kids and try to give them advice, only to see them be butchered within minutes or hours of the Hunger Games. And I'm sure after a few years, it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. And it's not that hard to believe that here is a man who, even though he won a Hunger Games and was rewarded with all these riches, et cetera, would turn out to be, an alcoholic. It's just, I can't deal with this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. So there's some pathos behind his, somewhat, comic exterior or worthless exterior. Underneath, there's somebody who's obviously smart enough to have won the Hunger Games. And then, like I said, once Katniss and Peeta look like maybe they have a chance to win, he works behind the scenes. And we see this again, especially in the movie, to help them. So a very interesting character. He's still my favorite character in the story. All right. Oh, who does Peeta kill unintentionally? And this brings up another thing I like about the book. I don't know if you noticed this or not, but neither Peeta nor Katniss are what we would call like killing machines, right? This is not a story where Katniss goes into battle and kills 6 other kids, all by herself. I think Collins is very careful to only have, Katniss kill in very extreme and very, realistic and relatable situations, right? So it's not like she just goes through and, kills a bunch of 12-year-old kids for no reason in battle. And the same is, well, Peeta even admits, I'm not a warrior, I'm a baker's son. How long am I going to last? I'm not going to last long. I'm not going to win this thing. Uh, so he doesn't actually even kill anybody directly, but he does sort of indirectly, which I thought was interesting, which is why I asked the question. But he left he collected poison berries, which he didn't know were poison, the Nightlock, and Foxface came upon them and didn't know they were poison either, and she eats them and she's killed. So indirectly, that was the answer to that question. Indirectly, he's responsible. He can chalk up 1 kill on his ledger. But again, neither one of them, are these killers, because I think, we obviously want to identify with them and sympathize with them. And I think Collins is very clever in showing that they are both very reluctant killers, instead of people who will just go out and kill the weak that they know that they can beat. So we never see that. In fact, all of the violence is kind of downplayed. As violent as the scenario is, a lot of the violence is kind of downplayed in the book, and then particularly in the movie, because in the movie, they wanted to get a PG rating. So even some of the climactic moments are kind of downplayed. Anyway, let me give you another number while I'm thinking about it. How about 55? 55. All right, well, I mentioned the mutations. They are genetically engineered wolf, part human being. This kind of brings up what I was just talking about. In the book, they take on the faces of the dead tributes. Ugh. Or at least have parts of the faces of the dead tributes. And when I remember when I first read that, I thought, my God, how are they going to show that in a movie and still get a PG rating? Because obviously, again, the whole scenario is very disturbing. But of all the things that are described, this was the most disturbing to me. And I thought, boy, this would be really nightmare inducing for a lot of kids. But as I just mentioned, in the movie, all of these scenes, the mutation scenes, are like very darkly lit, and you can kind of barely see them. And when you do see them, they do not take on the faces of the dead tributes. So they did change that, which didn't surprise me. But again, the game makers can throw all kinds of obstacles into the games. Um, Remember the big fireball they threw in Katniss's way when she was getting a little bit too far away from everybody? So they're watching all this, and so they want to speed things up. So they create these horrific monsters. And of course, as we mentioned, they kill Thresh. We don't see that, or it's not described, but that's what we can assume had happened. Now, we're coming to the end. There is a stalemate with 3 tributes remaining, and that's the word she uses. And a stalemate in chess is when, well, I'll use the more common analogy in any movie where one person has a gun trained on the other who also has a gun trained on them. It's kind of like this. And it's like, okay, nobody has the upper hand. What do we do now? Kind of thing. That's kind of what a stalemate is, um, unless you didn't know or had to look it up. And she actually uses that word. This is the stalemate. And the stalemate is when the 3 of them are up on top of the cornucopia, right? Remember the scene? And Katniss has an arrow trained on Cato, who has Peeta like in a headlock. And the issue is that obviously if Katniss puts an arrow in Cato, he's holding on to Peeta, so they'll both go over the edge where the mutations await. So it's like, what do we do now? So that's the stalemate with 3 tributes remaining. That was the key part of that question, I think. Well, I think this is shown really well in the movie. At some point, Katniss has, his hand kind of on, how does he have it? He has his hand somewhere on Cato, and he kind of makes a nod to Katniss and kind of moves his thumb a little bit and says, that's where you should shoot. And of course, she's very good. She's a very good shot. So she hits the spot exactly. And Cato goes over the edge, basically. And Peeta does not. And so this leads to, and this is pretty sick and twisted and disturbing, but this is a quote right from her narration. She says, "This is the climax of the Hunger Games, and the audience expects a show." And what she's referring to here is the fact that Cato now has fallen to the ground, and he's being slowly mauled, and I guess eaten, half eaten, however you want to describe it or imagine it. But as she mentions, they want to drag this out as long as they can, because this is the finale, right? We have the 2 remaining tributes who are going to be the victors, supposedly. And the last one who could have challenged them, slowly but surely it's torture, what's going on, what's happening. So Cato is the last tribute to die. And she actually is the cause of his death. She puts an arrow in him to put him out of his misery because, they were taking their time doing this because this was the climax of the show. The audience expected something really awful and horrible. And in a way, she kind of deprived them of that because she just didn't want to see this poor kid go through any more suffering. So it shows, again, a little bit of empathy, even toward their arch rival who would have killed them without blinking. She had a little bit of empathy at the end. And that couldn't have played very well with the people in the Capitol, too. All right. Well, they did it again at the end. We said that they can do whatever they want. So they do change the rules again. And they very snarkily say, There can only be one winner. We changed our minds, basically. May the odds be ever in your favor. Ha ha ha. And so we have the scene now, really, the climactic scene, I would suppose, where they have to decide who's going to kill who. And then Katniss comes up with this idea of them eating the berries, committing double suicide so that they deprive the capital of any winner. And we can talk a little bit about the ramifications of this. And I think it's shown more in the movie than it is in the book. I can't help but think, after watching the movie, particularly in how it's acted, that I think Katniss, in a way, is calling the bluff of the Capitol, because I think she understands that they have to have a winner. So the fact that they go through this Hunger Games and then have no winner at all would be something that they would not want. So when she says, trust me, before they're about to eat the berries, I think she's perfectly willing to go along with the plan, and I think he is too. But I think in the back of her mind, I think she might know that they would like step in and stop it, because they have to have a winner, right? And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, because a big part of the games, isn't it, is to parade the winner around, have the big season finale where they interview them and make a big fuss over them and give them all these riches. And then there's a tour that's mentioned where they visit each district and say, here we are, we're the winners, and isn't this wonderful? And if you don't have that, that's a big part of the games for the Capitol. They need that spectacle too. They need that part of the show, and they can't have it end with like double suicide and there's nobody survived. That's an ending that might be so unpopular that their power might be threatened. So lo and behold, whether she planned it that way or not, the Capitol does stop them from the double suicide and announces that they are the two winners of the Hunger Games. For the first time ever, there are two winners. And then we have the resolution, I guess you would call it, the last chapter or two after this big moment. They're still in danger, though. And I love the line, in her narration. It's very ironic. She says, I've never been in more danger in my entire life, she says. And this is after she won the Hunger Games. You would think that would be the most dangerous, but now she's in even more danger. And if you answered this correctly, it would be something along the lines of, the reason they're still in danger is because the Capitol is threatened by them and feels like they got the better of them with this suicide act. And they don't take kindly to it, as I think Hamish points out. At least in the movie, he says it that way. And so they have to really save themselves from further persecution. Of course, the Capitol wouldn't just punish them, they'd punish their families and whatever. They wouldn't stop at just the two of them. So there's more at stake than just their own lives. So what they have to do is, in that season finale, the final interview, they just have to pretend like, oh, we didn't know what we were doing. We weren't trying to, one up the Capitol. We just are so madly in love with one another that the thought of living without each other, we just couldn't do it. And they're able to do that. Even Katniss, who, as I said, through most of the story, is not really into the whole star-crossed lover thing. I think by the end, she obviously has feelings for Peeta. So it's easy for her to do this. And maybe she does have feelings too. But they're able to play it off well enough for the cameras that they're saved. But certainly Katniss Everdeen has established herself as a real threat. She's the girl on fire, she's the one who, regardless of what they may say, did get the best of the Capitol. And now they have to do something about her. And if you read on to the second book, you have the 75th Hunger Games, which is the Quarter Quell, where they do something really special. And they decide for the 75th games to have previous winners compete again. And I think that was probably, that decision was probably made knowing that Katniss then would come back and we'd have another chance to take her out before she becomes too popular. But things, well, again, I'm not gonna give away plot spoilers. I encourage you to read the other two books and watch the movies as well. I think the movies are really good adaptations of the books. All right, a couple of last questions. It's a big season finale. This is so sick. It's like the ultimate terrible reality show. And one of the things they do is to show highlights, so-called highlights of the season. And that would include, obviously, the deaths of all the different tributes and how they were killed. It's so sick when you think about it. But now she has a chance to watch this. And of course, she was in the field when all this was going on. So a lot of this she did not see herself. But she's watching, and she did notice that they left one very important scene out, or one scene I think she thought would be important. And the answer to this question is, of course, they didn't show what she did for Rue after Rue was killed, that very moving scene. Now, of course, when it happened live, they couldn't change it because it was going out live and they couldn't cut away. But this is not something that they wanted to remind the people about. The sooner people forget about, one person from one district helping another, the better. So this was not considered a highlight by the Capitol. So they made sure they didn't show it again. So very interesting. And then finally, the very last moment of the book, and this kind of ties in with a classical archetype I brought up the other day. When the hero is done with their journey, their trek, their odyssey, often the ending of the story involves them returning back home, reintegration into society. And we have that in the end of book one, where the very last scene is she and Peeta reunited, holding hands, about to be welcomed by all of the other people in District 12. So they're back home as winners of the 74th Hunger Games. But of course, it's not over. The story just ends there for now. But so much more is going to happen in this series, which I encourage you to read if you have not read the rest of it. All right, let me give you another number. 61. 61. All right, the last thing I'll cover today is a couple of the questions that I had you answer for today. I haven't gotten to all your answers yet. Actually, I'm recording this on Wednesday, the day before July 4th. So I haven't gotten your answers yet. But I wanted to cover these. And then, as I said, I'll share some of your personal comments, your opinion, the opinion questions. I'll save those for next time. But let's go over these. And I think this is a good way to wrap up like everything I've been trying to give to you over the last lecture and a half. And one of the questions was, what classical archetypes do you see in the Hunger Games? And if you were using the Canvas files and articles that I gave you, you might have come up with a list similar to this. Maybe not as many as I did, but that's why they pay me the big money. I'm going to give you some more. Here are the various classical archetypes that I found in the Hunger Games. Katniss is a warrior, she's a lover, she's a scapegoat, certainly a proto-feminist hero. It's refreshing to have a woman who is in charge and is the leader and is the strongest character, both mentally and physically in the story. You could call her a defiant anti-hero. She's a reluctant hero. We're going to see that in the future books. It's kind of like, you know what? I don't want to be this symbol for the rebellion. I don't want to be the girl on fire, but circumstances kind of force her to be that, and she's up to the challenge. I'm not going to give too much away by saying she's up to the challenge. That's all I'll say. It's very special. Born and raised in a rural setting. You don't get much more rural than District 12. That's out really, it's like coal mining country. She goes through the different stages of a hero's journey. Her sister is picked and she volunteers in her sister's stead. And that leads to this, I don't want to call it an adventure, I'll call it this great trial, which is the Hunger Games. So at some point she has to depart District 12 and take part in the games. She's initiated, there's training involved. There's also chances for them to show their skills. We talked about this the other day. And then you could call the games themselves the road of trials, all the different things she has to encounter and overcome. In some cases through her skills, in some cases due to her intellect or her cunning or her knowledge. And also, it's important to note, in some cases she survives because she has empathy as well. I mean, why did she survive? What's one of the reasons she lived? It's because she showed empathy toward Rue, which was then rewarded by, Thresh sparing her life. Let's not forget that. Sometimes we say, what are all the skills that Katniss shows to help her survive? Well, yeah, she knows how to find water and she knows how to do a bow and arrow and, all this stuff. But her empathy for others helped her survive as well. There is the innermost cave, which I just talked about, literally, and the ending is the return and reintegration with society. So it clicks all those boxes. There are certain archetypal situations, the different tasks, the journey, the ritual. There are a number of crossroads moments in the story. I brought this up the other day. Moments where the character, kind of has two choices to make or two roads to take, and she can't take both, so she has to pick one over the other. Certainly the decision to volunteer for her sister, that was a decision. She didn't have to do that, but she did. Other crossroads I would think would be, the standoff on top of the cornucopia, which I just mentioned. And then also, obviously, the scene with the two of them with the nightlock. What do we do? What's do I kill you? Do you kill me? Or is there another option? Well, there is another option. Let's do this. So any number of moments of high tension where the character has to, decide one thing or the other. So we have a number of crossroads moments. We literally have the haven versus the wilderness. The capital is the well-fed, rich 1% who has all the wonderful things that are deprived the people out in the wilderness, so to speak. And if you'll notice, this is a part of the dystopian world that she's created. The capital has access to all of these wonderful advancements in technology. And by the way, medicine, right? I mean, they have access to healing broth and salve that will, close up your wounds practically overnight. But, the people in District 12 don't have access to any of this stuff. That's something that's not really mentioned. But when you stop and think about it, they have access to all this wonderful technology and medicine and advancements and all kinds of things. But, the folks out in the wilderness don't get that stuff. And obviously, I mean, this is a central conflict between good and evil. Character archetypes, we have the hero, the initiates could be the tributes. We literally have a mentor figure that's they even call him, I'm your mentor, and he's our mentor. They even use that word. I don't know if I was stretching a couple of these, but the friendly beast archetype is usually that character or monster or something who actually looks scary and is very imposing, but ultimately has a good and kind and wise heart and an empathetic heart. I thought maybe Thresh might be considered that. The evil figure with ultimately a good heart. I don't think we see this in the book. Cato comes across as pretty evil throughout. But I was referring to the movie version where he has a moment at the end where he kind of reveals that maybe he isn't all that, you know, supportive of the whole system, but it's something he's been kind of forced to do all his life. You know, he's a career, so this is what he's been trained to do all his life. And I think he has a moment of epiphany at the end. It's kind of like, well, is this what you want? This is what you want, right? You want me to do this. And so, it kind of shows that maybe he's not 100% evil. Obviously, President Snow would be that shadowy figure or that devil figure. I love the proto-feminist twist on this one. We do have a damsel in distress in this story, but it's really Peeta. It's Peeta who keeps finding himself in dangerous situations and needs to be rescued, and it's Katniss who does so. And by the way, not to give too much away, but that's not going to change in the later books. It's kind of the same thing. And of course, the star-crossed lovers is a concept that goes all the way back to mythology. The other question I ask you was, like any good dystopian work, it's making commentary on our culture and our society today. And here are just a few of the things I came up with. Maybe some of your answers are similar. Certainly the growing gap between rich and poor. You know, we talked about how the 1%, you know, in the capital controls everything. There's a certain generation gap, the old keeping up traditions, the young must continue. Uh, this is something I saw in the story that maybe most people don't see, but I get the sense that one of the reasons they keep doing it is because they've always done it. And, you know, if I lost family members in the Hunger Games, and then people are starting to talk about not doing it anymore, I'm going to be offended because I'm going to think, hey, I went through it, you know, now you got to go through it. Um, I'm also wondering about people who had to go through those, you know, selections from 12 to 18, but then once they turned 18 and they didn't have to do it anymore, might their feelings about the Hunger Games be different? It's kind of like, all right, I'm done with it. Now let you go through it. Ha ha ha, or whatever. There's a certain amount of truth in that, I think, human beings being the way they are. Um, it's certainly a takeoff on fake reality shows. This is supposed to be real, but so much of it is fake. And again, particularly the whole star-crossed lovers thing, she puts that on through most of the story. It's only maybe toward the end that she really starts to have feelings for Peeta. But she knows it works. She knows it works, so she works to the camera. They mentioned gambling. I mean, you can bet on these people. Gambling has never been bigger. Legalized gambling has never been bigger now it's bigger now than it ever has been. Um, we are obsessed with the sensational. We're obsessed with violence. Um, I'm going to talk more about this with my hypothetical situation next time around. Um, let's face it, one of the lessons here is beauty and attractiveness are overly important. You know, one of the things they learn, and it's one of the things Haymitch tries to teach them is, you want to survive, they've got to like you. The people watching out there have to like you. They have to be attracted to you. They got to pull for you. So that's one of the reasons why she has all these stylists, right? Cinna is her stylist, and she's just kind of a plain girl from District 12. And it's like, we got to work on you because we got to make you look pretty or as pretty as we can, because that will help get you sponsors. If you're not all that attractive, it's going to be hard to sell you, you know. So they work on her, and voila, she becomes Jennifer Lawrence. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, so yeah, that's a part of the deal too. Power in the hands of the few. We've already talked about this. Divide and conquer. We've already talked about this too. If I keep the districts fighting amongst themselves, they won't come after me if I'm President Snow, right? Divide and conquer. And then finally, another term that I think Collins very directly wanted to make a comparison to is there's a famous statement or a famous phrase. It's goes way back to mythology days. It's a Latin term, panem a circenses. And of course, the name of the country is Panem. So there's an obvious comparison that's meant to be made. And the phrase is translated into bread and circuses. And basically, this is a political philosophy that some leaders, particularly in dictatorships, have adhered to over the years. Basically, what it means is if we, the small number in control, the 1%, if you want to use a more common expression, the ones who have all the money and most of the money and all the power and so on. All right, as long as we keep the rest of the people fed, as long as they have bread, symbol for food, as long as we give them bread, as long as they're well fed, as long as we don't have people starving in the streets, wondering where their next meal is going to come from, or wondering where they're going to sleep that night because they don't have shelter. As long as we keep them, as long as we provide them the basic necessities, as long as we keep them fed, and as long as we provide them circuses, we don't have too many circuses today, but it's really a metaphor for entertainment. As long as we keep them entertained, right? As long as we keep them distracted, as long as we keep them well-fed and distracted, then we can do pretty much whatever the hell we want behind the scenes. We can take away their rights slowly but surely, but they won't care because they're too distracted by stuff. And this is a theme and this is a philosophy that we've seen throughout history. And you could make the case that it's never been more true than today, simply because there have never been more avenues for entertainment than there are today. Like I said, we don't have circuses much anymore, which is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But as long as I have my big screen TV, and as long as I have my internet, and as long as I have my TikTok, and as long as I have my Instagram and my Facebook, as long as I have my sports, as long as I have my Olympics coming up, I'm going to watch that. As long as I have my Super Bowl, as long as I have my movies, I'm a big Star Wars fan, or I'm a big, TV fan. I can't wait for the next season of whatever, and I'm going to binge watch that. As long as I'm entertained, then you can do whatever, or I won't be paying attention, or I don't want to bother. Oh, I know I should probably protest this or that or whatever, but I'm content. I'm happy with my life. Just leave me alone, kind of thing. And that's been a powerful philosophy, because human nature being as it is, it tends to be true no matter whether it's hundreds of years ago or today. And I would make the case that it's more true today than ever. Okay, because of all the different distractions we have, right? So I think we see that in the story as well. Certainly true of the capital, and some of the richer districts. Same thing. They're more likely to support the Hunger Games because they win the Hunger Games every year, right? And they're doing pretty well, So, if you're doing okay and, you're relatively well off, you're not going to complain if, some of these rights start to be taken away from you. All right, so I'll be interested to see what some of your comments were, if they were similar to mine, or maybe you came up with some other ones too, and I'll share those next time around. And then just to kind of recap dystopian fiction, all the ones I went through, or many of the ones I went through earlier today, we see in the Hunger Games. You can't move from district to district. In fact, there are supposedly electrical fences. There's no communication between the districts. Certainly there are economic inequalities, government control in the hands of the few. We have surveillance. We have fights for survival, lack of life essentials in the poorer districts. We see that. We see propaganda. The Capitol wants to rewrite history. Oh, there was a terrible uprising. It was horrible and it divided so many people, but we put it down and you should thank us for that. And just as a reminder, every year we're going to have Hunger Games, just in case you forgot how wonderful we are to save you from all that chaos. We're going to remind you every year with the Hunger Games. So they'll have propaganda, they'll rewrite history, no due process. There is a figurehead as such. I guess we could call that President Snow, but I wouldn't put him in the big brother category. It sounds to me like he's kind of he's kind of a representative. He's the leader now, but there will be other presidents before and after him. And again, if you want a little backstory on President Snow, she did come out with a book and then also the movie, which I encourage you to read. And again, I mentioned this, no religion mentioned whatsoever in this book at all. Strict conformity, the militarized police forces. And again, if you really want a good example of this, again, watch the movie version. When District 11 tries to rebel, you have all these armed, stormtroopers. They look like stormtroopers out of Star Wars, actually, who very quickly overtake the unarmed citizens of District 11. Loss of freedom and identity, and they're banned from the natural world. So, remember, it is illegal for her to go into the woods to hunt, but she does that. It's one of the first signs of her rebellion. All right, so those were my answers to that question, the archetypes we see. I think there are a lot of interesting commentary on our society, as any good dystopian work will do. And then there are very obvious characteristics from dystopian fiction in the work. All right, let me give you one last number, 62. 62 will be our last number. All right, that's it for today. All right, again, I'll next talk to you on Monday. The assignments are due Sunday by midnight. Have a wonderful holiday, July 4th. And again, if you have any questions or issues, please let me know by email, and I will give you a nice wave. Thank you, everybody.